The crowd fell silent the moment he stepped into the arena. No flashy entrance, no wasted movement, just a calm, deadly presence that made even the strongest fighters uneasy. They had heard the rumors, but none of them were ready for the truth. This wasn't just another tournament. For Bruce Lee, this was personal. Honor had been shattered, his school disgraced, his family name dragged through the dirt. And now, every punch, every step, every breath carried one purpose: revenge. Across the ring stood the world's most elite fighters, each one confident, each one dangerous. But none of them understood what they were about to face. Because Bruce Lee wasn't here to compete, he was here to prove a point. And before the night was over, the entire world would witness what happens when honor, revenge, and power collide. The moment the news spread, it didn't just damage a name, it tore through generations of respect, discipline, and hard-earned honor. What had once been a place of pride, a sanctuary where students came to sharpen their bodies and discipline their minds, was now being whispered about in doubt. Bruce Lee's school, built on principles of dedication, humility, and strength, was suddenly under attack, not just physically, but reputationally. And in the world of martial arts, reputation was everything. Once it cracked, even slightly, the entire foundation began to tremble. It started with a challenge, one that was never meant to be fair. Rival fighters, fueled by jealousy and arrogance, had been watching from the sidelines for years. They saw the rise of a different kind of martial artist, someone who didn't blindly follow tradition, someone who questioned outdated methods and reshaped the very idea of combat. That alone was enough to attract critics. But when Bruce Lee began to gain recognition, when his students started proving their skill in real situations, it ignited something far more dangerous: envy. The whispers came first. Quiet conversations in dimly lit training halls, subtle remarks, made behind closed doors. They questioned the legitimacy of his techniques, mocked his philosophy, and doubted the strength of his students. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the usual resistance to change. But soon, the whispers turned into challenges, and the challenges turned into something far more aggressive. One evening, without warning, a group of fighters arrived at the school. They weren't there to learn. Their eyes carried intent. Their posture radiated hostility. This wasn't a test of skill, it was an attack on everything the school stood for. Students who had trained for discipline suddenly found themselves forced into a confrontation they weren't prepared for. The air shifted from calm focus to chaos in seconds. What followed wasn't just a fight, it was a statement. Every strike, thrown by the intruders, carried disrespect. They weren't trying to prove superiority through technique. They were trying to humiliate, to dismantle the image of strength and control that Bruce Lee had built. Some students stood their ground, fueled by loyalty and courage, but the situation was uneven from the start. This wasn't a controlled sparring match. It was calculated disruption. By the time it ended, the physical damage was visible. But the real wound ran deeper. The school, once filled with confidence and unity, now felt shaken. Doubt crept into the minds of students. Had they been taught something incomplete? Were the critics right? Questions that had never existed before now lingered in every corner of the training floor, and then came the stories. Exaggerated accounts of the incident spread rapidly. Rivals didn't just report what happened, they reshaped it. In their version, Bruce Lee's school had been exposed, its methods proven weak, its students easily defeated. The narrative was carefully twisted to serve one purpose: destroy credibility. In the martial arts community, perception often mattered as much as reality, and this perception was turning toxic. Students began to feel the weight of it outside the school as well. Conversations changed. Respectful nods were replaced with skeptical glances. Invitations to demonstrations or friendly competitions quietly stopped coming. The school wasn't just dealing with internal doubt, it was facing external isolation. For Bruce Lee, this wasn't just an attack on a building or a group of students, it was an attack on a vision. He had dedicated himself to breaking barriers, to creating a philosophy that emphasized adaptability, efficiency, and truth in combat. He believed martial arts should evolve, should reflect reality rather than tradition, for tradition's sake. But now, that vision was being used against him, twisted into something controversial, something unproven. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily. Every student who had walked through his doors trusted him, not just to teach techniques, but to guide them toward confidence and strength. And now, that trust was being tested in ways no training session could have prepared them for. There was also something deeper at stake. Family. Honor wasn't just a personal concept. It was tied to lineage, to identity, to everything that came before. The disgrace didn't stop at the school's walls. It echoed into the past, into the name that Bruce Lee carried with pride. To have that name questioned, to have it dragged through doubt and criticism, wasn't something that could be ignored. But what made the situation even more intense was the silence that followed. There was no immediate retaliation, no public confrontation, just a quiet, controlled stillness. To outsiders, it might have seemed like hesitation. To those who understood Bruce Lee, it was something else entirely. A gathering of focus, a sharpening, of intent. Inside the school, the atmosphere slowly began to change again. The initial shock faded, replaced by something colder, something more determined. Training sessions became more intense, more precise. Every movement was analyzed, every weakness addressed. This wasn't just about improvement anymore, it was about rebuilding something that had been shaken. Students who had once trained for personal growth now carried a shared purpose. The doubt that had crept in didn't disappear overnight, but it began to transform. Instead of weakening them, it pushed them to question, to refine, to become better. The very criticism meant to break them started to forge something stronger, and at the center of it all stood Bruce Lee, calm, observant, and unshaken on the surface. But beneath that calm was a fire that hadn't been there before. Not reckless anger, not blind rage, but something far more controlled and dangerous. A clear understanding that honor, once challenged, demanded more than words. Every detail of that day remained etched in memory. The look in his students' eyes, the sound of doubt creeping into conversations, the way respect had shifted into skepticism. None of it was forgotten, because forgetting would mean accepting, and acceptance was not an option. The martial arts world continued to move, but the tension lingered. Rivals watched closely, waiting to see what would happen next. Some expected a public response, a challenge thrown back in defiance. Others believed the damage had already been done, that the school would slowly fade into irrelevance. But they underestimated one thing: the nature of true honor. Honor isn't restored through words or arguments. It isn't rebuilt through explanations or defenses. It demands action, undeniable and absolute. And when that moment came, it wouldn't just address the doubts, it would erase them. Every step forward from that point carried meaning. Every training session, every moment of silence, every controlled breath was leading toward something inevitable. The shattered reputation wasn't being patched up, it was being reforged. And somewhere beyond the walls of the school, beyond the whispers and the skepticism, a stage was waiting. A place where skill couldn't be denied, where truth couldn't be twisted, where the outcome would speak louder than any rumor ever could. Because when honor is shattered, it doesn't disappear. It transforms into something far more powerful, something that doesn't seek approval, doesn't ask for validation, but instead demands recognition through undeniable force. At first, it didn't look like revenge. There was no outburst, no public declaration, no visible sign of anger that others could point to and say, "That's where it began." Instead, it settled quietly beneath the surface, hidden behind calm eyes and controlled breathing. But inside, something had shifted. Every memory of disrespect, every whispered doubt, every moment of humiliation had begun to take shape into a single, unbreakable force. It wasn't the kind of revenge fueled by blind rage. That kind burns fast and fades just as quickly. This was different. This was precise, calculated, and patient. The kind that waits, that studies, that sharpens itself until the moment arrives, where it cannot fail. For Bruce Lee, revenge wasn't about proving others wrong with words. It was about showing them a truth they could not ignore. Each morning started earlier than before. The quiet hours when the world still slept became a space for reflection and refinement. Movements that were already fast became faster. Techniques that were already effective became sharper, more efficient. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary effort. Every strike, every step carried intention. It wasn't just training anymore. It was preparation for something inevitable. The memory of that day lingered in everything. The way his students had looked, confused, shaken, questioning themselves. The sound of mocking voices echoing through the training hall. The feeling of something sacred being disrespected. Those weren't distractions. They were fuel. Instead of weakening focus, they strengthened it. Every repetition of a punch carried that memory. Every defensive movement was shaped by it. But revenge, in its truest form, required more than physical strength. It demanded clarity. Emotion had to be controlled, not unleashed recklessly. Anger had to be refined into something useful. And that's where Bruce Lee separated himself from everyone else. He didn't let the desire for revenge cloud his judgment. He used it to sharpen his understanding. He began to analyze everything. Not just his own techniques, but the styles of those who had challenged him. Their patterns, their habits, their weaknesses. Every detail was studied with relentless focus. He broke down their movements, questioned their logic, and looked for the gaps hidden beneath their confidence. What others saw as strength, he saw as limitation. What others relied on, he learned to dismantle. Training sessions became something else entirely. Students could feel the difference. The pace was more intense, the expectations higher. There was no room for hesitation, no tolerance for half-effort. It wasn't about pushing them beyond their limits for the sake of toughness. It was about preparing them for reality. Because reality didn't care about comfort, it didn't reward hesitation, and the next time they faced a challenge, there would be no room for doubt. Some students struggled at first. The shift was sudden, the intensity overwhelming. But those who stayed began to understand. They saw that this wasn't just about revenge for one incident. It was about transformation, about becoming something stronger, something undeniable. The same doubt that had once crept into their minds began to disappear, replaced by focus and determination. Outside the school, the world continued to talk. Critics grew louder, more confident. They believed the silence meant defeat. They believed the lack of response confirmed their claims. But they didn't see what was happening behind closed doors. They didn't see the hours of relentless practice, the constant refinement, the evolution taking place with every passing day. Revenge doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until it reaches a point where it no longer needs to be explained. And that's exactly what was happening. Bruce Lee wasn't preparing to argue with his critics. He was preparing to erase their arguments entirely. Every movement he practiced carried a sense of inevitability. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It flowed naturally, like water finding its path. But beneath that fluidity was power, controlled, precise, and ready to be unleashed at the exact right moment. He wasn't just training harder. He was training smarter, adapting his approach, refining his philosophy. The idea of limitation began to disappear completely. Traditional boundaries, rigid techniques, predictable patterns, all of it was questioned and reshaped. Revenge, in this sense, became more than a response to an insult. It became a catalyst for growth, pushing him to break through anything that could be used against him. And with that growth came confidence. Not the loud, boastful kind, but something deeper. A quiet certainty that when the time came, there would be no doubt, no hesitation. Just action, clear and decisive. The memory of his family, of the name he carried, remained close. It wasn't just about personal pride. It was about something larger, something rooted in identity and legacy. To allow that to be disrespected Without response wasn't an option. But the response had to be worthy. It had to be something that didn't just answer the insult, but redefined the standard entirely. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into something that felt like a continuous buildup of energy. Every moment of preparation added to it. Every drop of sweat, every corrected mistake, every refined technique contributed to something that was growing stronger with time. There were moments of stillness too, times when everything paused, when movement stopped and thought took over. In those moments, revenge wasn't about the past. It was about the future, about what needed to be done, how it needed to be done, and what it would take to make it undeniable. And in that stillness, there was clarity. No distractions, no unnecessary thoughts, just a clear understanding of purpose. The insult, the attack, the damage, it all pointed toward one thing. A moment that hadn't happened yet, but was getting closer with every passing day. The people who doubted, who mocked, who dismissed, they became part of that purpose. Not as enemies to be hated, but as obstacles to be overcome. Their criticism became a measure of progress. The louder they got, the more it confirmed that something significant was happening. Revenge in this form wasn't destructive. It wasn't about tearing others down for the sake of it. It was about building something so strong, so undeniable, that it left no room for doubt. It was about turning every negative into something that pushed forward, that strengthened rather than weakened. The idea of fear disappeared completely. Not because there was nothing to fear, but because fear no longer had control. It became just another factor to be understood and managed. Another element in the process of preparation, and as everything continued to build, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be a simple response. It wasn't going to be a single fight or a quick demonstration. It was going to be something bigger. Something that brought everything together in one place where skill, focus, and determination would be tested at the highest level. The tournament wasn't just an opportunity. It was the stage. The place where everything would come together, where preparation would meet reality, where theory would face proof, where doubt would either survive or be completely destroyed. Every step toward that moment carried weight. Every decision, every adjustment, every refinement was leading toward it. There was no room for error, no space for hesitation, because when the moment arrived, everything would be on the line, not just personal pride, but honor, reputation, and everything that had been questioned. And through it all, the feeling remained constant, not explosive, not overwhelming, but steady and unshakable. A quiet force that guided every action, every thought, every movement. Revenge wasn't something that needed to be expressed loudly. It didn't need words or declarations. It existed in the work, in the preparation, in the transformation that was taking place day by day. And when the time came, it wouldn't need to be explained. It would be seen, felt, and understood in a way that left no room for interpretation. They came from every corner of the world, each carrying a reputation built on years of discipline, victories, and unchallenged dominance. Fighters whose names alone were enough to silence a room, whose presence commanded respect before they even made a move. Some were masters of traditional styles, rooted in centuries-old techniques refined through generations. Others were modern warriors, fast, aggressive, unpredictable. Every one of them had earned their place through skill, strength, and a belief that they belonged at the top. The tournament arena became a gathering point of power unlike anything seen before. The air itself felt heavier, charged with anticipation and ego. Conversations were short, calculated. Eyes didn't just look, they measured, analyzed, judged. Every fighter there knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about winning a title. It was about proving superiority in front of the world. Each competitor had a story. One had dominated regional championships for years, breaking opponents with relentless force and unshakable confidence. Another was known for speed so precise it seemed almost impossible to counter, striking before most even realized the fight had begun. There were those who relied on brute strength, overwhelming opponents with sheer physical power, and others who fought with a quiet, methodical approach, waiting for the perfect moment to end the fight with a single decisive move. They had faced challengers before. They had been tested, pushed, and forced to adapt. But deep down, many of them believed they had already seen everything there was to see. That belief, built over years of victory, had turned into certainty. And certainty, when left unchecked, often became the very weakness no one noticed. When Bruce Lee entered that space, the shift was subtle at first. No loud reactions, no immediate recognition from everyone. But among those who truly understood martial arts, there was a pause. A moment where something felt different. Not because of size or appearance, but because of presence. There was no tension in his movement. No unnecessary display of strength. Just a calm, controlled energy that didn't need to prove itself. Some fighters dismissed him immediately. To them, he didn't look like the traditional image of dominance. He wasn't the biggest, he didn't carry the same rigid posture, and his style didn't fit into their understanding of structured combat. They saw unfamiliarity and mistook it for weakness. Others were more cautious. They had heard whispers, seen glimpses, understood that there was something about him that didn't follow the usual rules. As the tournament progressed, each match revealed something about the competitors. Styles clashed, techniques were tested, and weaknesses began to show. Fighters who had dominated in their own environments now faced opponents who challenged their assumptions. Some adapted quickly, adjusting their approach mid-fight. Others struggled, held back by habits they couldn't break in the heat of the moment. Bruce Lee observed everything, every movement, every reaction, every pattern. He wasn't just watching fights, he was studying them. Breaking them down, understanding the rhythm of each opponent, identifying the moments where control was lost, where hesitation appeared. While others focused on winning their matches, he focused on understanding the entire field. The contrast between him and the other fighters became more apparent with each passing round. Many relied on set combinations, rehearsed techniques repeated under pressure. Their movements were powerful, but often predictable. They followed patterns that had worked for them before, trusting in familiarity. Bruce Lee's approach was different. There was no rigid structure, no fixed sequence. His movements adapted in real time, responding to the situation rather than forcing it into a predefined form. He didn't fight against his opponent's strength. He moved around it, through it, using it against them. When his first match began, the atmosphere shifted again. His opponent was experienced, confident, and fully aware of the expectations placed on him. He approached with precision, testing distance, looking for openings. But what he faced wasn't what he expected. There was no delay, no hesitation. Bruce Lee moved with a fluidity that disrupted timing, broke rhythm, and made it impossible to predict what would come next. Strikes weren't telegraphed. They appeared and disappeared in the same instant, leaving no opportunity to react. Defense wasn't passive, it was active, turning every attempted attack into an opening. The match didn't last long, but it said everything it needed to. Not through spectacle, but through clarity. The difference in approach, in understanding, in execution, was undeniable. Word spread quickly among the remaining fighters. The dismissive attitudes began to fade, replaced by focus and caution. They started to realize that this wasn't just another competitor. This was someone who approached combat from an entirely different perspective. Each subsequent match reinforced that realization. Opponents came in with strategies, with plans designed to counter what they had observed. But those plans fell apart the moment the fight began. Because what they had observed wasn't a fixed style. It was adaptability itself. And adaptability couldn't be countered with rigid thinking. Some tried to overwhelm him with aggression, pushing forward with relentless attacks, but that only created openings, moments where control slipped just enough to be exploited. Others tried to slow the pace to force a more calculated exchange, but that gave him time, space to dictate the flow entirely. The more they tried to understand him, the more elusive he became. Because he wasn't bound by the same limitations. He didn't rely on a single approach. didn't commit to a pattern that could be studied and countered. He existed in the moment, adjusting constantly, staying one step ahead not through speed alone, but through awareness. Among the elite fighters, something began to change. Respect, once reserved for familiar styles and known techniques, started to shift. They began to see that what they were facing wasn't just skill, it was evolution, a level of understanding that went beyond tradition, beyond established systems. But with that respect came pressure. Each fighter knew that facing him would require more than their usual approach. It would demand something extra, something they weren't used to giving. And not all of them were ready for that. The deeper the tournament went, the higher the stakes became. Fatigue set in, not just physically, but mentally. The pressure of constant competition, of being surrounded by equally skilled opponents, began to take its toll. Small mistakes became more frequent. Reactions slowed just enough to be noticed. Bruce Lee remained unaffected by it, not because he didn't feel the strain, but because he had prepared for it. His training hadn't just been about technique, it had been about endurance, about maintaining clarity under pressure, about staying focused when everything else started to break down. The gap between him and the others became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about winning, it was about how he won. The efficiency, the control, the absence of wasted energy. While others fought to dominate, he fought to end the fight. By the time the final rounds approached, the narrative had completely shifted. He was no longer the outsider, no longer the underestimated participant. He had become the standard everyone else was measured against. And for the fighters who remained, the realization was clear. This wasn't just a competition anymore. It was a confrontation with something they hadn't prepared for, something that challenged everything they believed about combat. Each of them had entered the tournament believing they were among the best. But now, standing across from Bruce Lee, they were forced to question what the best truly meant. Because being elite wasn't just about strength or speed or experience. It was about understanding, about adaptability, about being able to face something completely different and still find a way to respond. And in that arena, surrounded by the world's most skilled fighters, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just one man against many. This was a test of everything they thought they knew, against someone who refused to be defined by any of it. Power, in its rawest form, is often misunderstood. Many see it as brute strength, the ability to overpower an opponent through sheer force. Others define it through speed, believing that the fastest strike always wins. But in that arena, surrounded by the world's most elite fighters, power began to take on a completely different meaning. It wasn't just about what could be seen. It was about what could be felt in the smallest movements, in the space between action and reaction, in the precise moment where control shifted from one fighter to another. Bruce Lee carried that kind of power. Not loud, not exaggerated, not wasted. It existed in stillness as much as it did in motion. When he stood across from an opponent, there was no visible tension, no obvious sign of preparation. But beneath that calm exterior was something refined to its absolute limit. Every muscle, every thought, every instinct aligned toward one purpose: efficiency. The concept of wasted movement didn't exist in his approach. Where others relied on wide, forceful strikes, he moved with precision so tight it almost seemed invisible. A punch wasn't just thrown, it was delivered at the exact moment it would have the greatest effect, traveling the shortest possible distance, carrying only the energy needed to end the exchange. Nothing more, nothing less. This efficiency created a kind of power that felt different to those who faced it. It wasn't something they could brace against or predict. It appeared suddenly, disrupted their balance, and disappeared before they could respond. It wasn't overwhelming in the traditional sense. It was decisive. As the tournament progressed toward its final stages, that power became more apparent with every match. Opponents who had relied on endurance found themselves unable to keep up with the pace he set. Fighters who depended on strength discovered that strength alone couldn't land a clean hit. Speed, which had been a defining advantage for many, became less effective when it was constantly being intercepted, redirected, or neutralized before it could fully develop. What made it even more difficult to deal with was the unpredictability. There was no pattern to memorize, no sequence to anticipate. Each movement flowed naturally into the next, shaped by the immediate situation rather than a pre-planned strategy. It forced opponents to think in real time, to abandon their habits and adapt instantly, a demand that few could meet under pressure. But power, in this context, wasn't just physical. It extended into presence, into the way he controlled the space around him. Distance became a weapon. Timing became a weapon. Even silence became a weapon. The absence of unnecessary movement created uncertainty, and uncertainty created hesitation. And in a fight, hesitation was often the difference between control and defeat. Those who stepped into the ring against him felt that shift almost immediately. The confidence they had carried into the match began to change, not disappear entirely, but adjust. They became more cautious, more aware of the consequences of a single mistake, and that awareness slowed them down just enough to create openings. Bruce Lee didn't force those openings, he allowed them to appear. By controlling the rhythm of the fight, by dictating when exchanges happened and when they didn't, he guided his opponents into positions where their own actions worked against them. It wasn't about overpowering, it was about outmaneuvering, outthinking, and outtiming. There were moments when the difference in power became undeniable. A single strike that landed cleanly, not with excessive force, but with perfect timing and placement, shifting the entire direction of the fight. A defensive movement that turned into an immediate counter, catching an opponent mid-action, leaving no room to recover. These weren't dramatic displays meant to impress. They were precise executions meant to conclude. The audience, watching from a distance, began to understand that what they were seeing wasn't just skill. It was mastery. Not the kind that relies on repetition alone, but the kind that evolves, that adapts, that continuously refines itself. It challenged their expectations, forced them to reconsider what power actually looked like. Among the remaining fighters, the realization deepened. They began to see that facing this kind of power required more than physical preparation. It demanded a shift in mindset, a willingness to abandon what had worked before and embrace something new. But that shift couldn't happen instantly, especially not under the pressure of a high-stakes tournament. Some tried to match his efficiency, tightening their movements, reducing unnecessary effort. But imitation without full understanding only led to hesitation. Others attempted to disrupt his rhythm through aggression, hoping to break the flow. But aggression without control only created more opportunities to be countered. The deeper truth was becoming clear. This wasn't a style they could simply counter. It wasn't confined to a specific set of techniques or rules. It was an expression of understanding, of awareness, of complete integration between mind and body. And that kind of power couldn't be easily replicated or resisted. As the final confrontations approached, the atmosphere in the arena changed once again. The energy, once filled with noise and anticipation, became more focused, more intense. Every movement carried weight, every decision mattered. There was no room left for error, no space for uncertainty. Bruce Lee remained unchanged in his approach, calm, observant, fully present. The journey through the tournament had only sharpened what was already there. Each match had added to his understanding, each opponent had contributed to the refinement of his execution. When the final challenge stood before him, it represented more than just another opponent. It was the culmination of everything that had led to this moment. The doubt, the preparation, the evolution. A test not just of skill, but of the principles that had guided him from the beginning. The fight itself reflected that culmination. There were no wasted exchanges, no unnecessary clashes of force. Every movement had purpose, every reaction was immediate and precise. It wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, deliberate, almost inevitable in its progression. The opponent, skilled and experienced, brought everything they had into the match. Strength, speed, strategy, all applied with full intensity. But even at that level, the difference remained. Not in effort, not in determination, but in understanding. Bruce Lee's power didn't clash. It flowed. It adjusted, responded, and redirected. Where force met resistance, it gave way and returned from another angle. Where speed attempted to overwhelm, it intercepted and neutralized. It wasn't about stopping the opponent. It was about guiding the outcome. And in that guidance, the result became clear. Not through domination in the traditional sense, but through complete control. A demonstration that power, when refined to its highest level, doesn't need to announce itself loudly. It doesn't rely on spectacle or excess. It exists in the smallest movements, in the precise timing of a single action, in the ability to end a fight with clarity rather than chaos. For those watching, for those who had competed, for those who had doubted, the understanding settled in. Power wasn't what they had assumed it to be. It wasn't limited to strength or speed or endurance. It was something deeper, something that required not just physical ability, but awareness, adaptability, and a complete understanding of movement and intention. And in that arena, at that moment, that kind of power had been fully realized, not as a concept, but as something undeniable, something that reshaped expectations and redefined what it meant to truly master the art of combat.